The champion cries. Mike Tyson breaks down on live TV after receiving a letter from President Ibrahim Traoré. It began as a routine morning show segment. Just another appearance in the media whirlwind surrounding Mike Tyson's highly anticipated memoir and upcoming Netflix documentary. Tyson, the former undisputed heavyweight champion of the world, sat in the bright lights of the studio, his signature stoic expression hiding a lifetime of war stories. His demeanor was calm, perhaps a little worn, but unmistakably composed. Few people knew the storms he had weathered. Fewer still understood the man beneath the myth. But what happened next would peel back decades of armor and expose a moment of unimaginable humanity. As the interview moved into its second half, the host leaned in with a knowing smile. "Mike," he said carefully, "you've seen a lot, fought harder than most. But today we have something different, something personal." Mike raised an eyebrow, more curious than cautious. "What's that?" The host reached off camera and took a cream-colored envelope, its edges lined in gold. "This letter arrived late last night," the host explained, "all the way from West Africa, from the president of Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré. And he insisted. It's for you. Only you. But he gave us permission to read it, if you're okay with that." Tyson, suddenly still, blinked. He gave a small nod, hesitant but intrigued. "Go ahead," he said softly. What followed would not. Only silence the room. It would shake the world. The host unfolded the letter slowly and began reading aloud. "Dear Mr. Tyson, my name is Ibrahim Traoré. I am the transitional president of Burkina Faso. I do not write to you today as a head of state, but as a young boy who once had nothing. I write to you as someone who, in the darkest corners of poverty and conflict, watched you on a flickering, black and white television, crowded in a noisy room with strangers. You were not just a boxer to me, you were hope made flesh. You were proof that pain could become power, that a child from nowhere could become a giant. When my country hurt, when it bled, I remembered the fire in your eyes, not your fists, Mike. Your eyes, the agony, the defiance, the sheer refusal to be broken. I now try to lead my people with that same fire. Thank you, Mike Tyson, not for your victories in the ring, but for teaching me to rise, not just as a fighter, but as a man." As the final lines echoed through the studio, Tyson sat frozen. His jaw trembled. His breathing changed. Then, in a voice choked with grief and disbelief, he whispered, "Stop. Just stop. For a second." The audience watched in stunned silence. As the most feared man in boxing reached for the edge of the table, his hands visibly shaking. The letter rested gently before him, but it might as well have been a weight from his childhood, a weight he had carried alone until now. Tears began to pool in his eyes, and though he tried to blink them back, the dam broke. "He saw me," Tyson whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "Not the knockouts, not the belts, just me." The cameras didn't cut. No one spoke. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath. "I was 14, Mike said, his voice cracking. "I was homeless. I was angry. I wanted to die. Nobody cared. Nobody saw me then. I fought because it was the only way I felt seen." The audience gasped. But this man, this president, halfway across the world, he watched me. And somehow, he became a leader. Mike broke down completely. Tears streamed freely now, not of shame, but of long-suppressed truth finally escaping its prison. The hardened fighter who had once knocked men out cold in under a minute was now the most vulnerable man in the room. "And you know what?" Mike said, voice shaking. "He didn't see a monster. He saw a mirror, a boy in pain, a survivor." The cameras faded to commercial, but the moment lingered. Even off-air, Mike sat motionless, clutching the letter like it was scripture. The host leaned in gently, whispering, "Do you want to keep going?" Mike nodded slowly. "Yeah, the world needs to hear this." When the show returned, all pretense had vanished. There were no more promotional questions, no sound bites, just truth. "Ibrahim Traoré," Mike began. "I've never met you, but I feel like I've known you my whole life." He paused, swallowing back another wave of emotion. "I wasn't supposed to survive. I was a thief, a criminal. I was locked up before I knew what love was. But you, man, you saw strength in my suffering. You turned it into something bigger." The room remained still as Tyson's voice filled the space like thunder rolling over a quiet valley. People don't talk about the nights you cry yourself to sleep, the hunger, the fear. But this letter, it told me I wasn't alone. That same evening, across the ocean in Burkina Faso's modest presidential office, President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone. His aides waited outside. The only sound in the room was the soft hum of an old ceiling fan and the flicker of the television screen. He watched, eyes fixed on the broadcast, as the man he had once idolized spoke his name with reverence. When Tyson cried, Traoré looked down, and quietly, he cried too. 2 lives, 2 continents, 1 letter. A shared story of pain, resilience, and redemption. And in that letter, between the ink and the tears, the world discovered that true greatness isn't born in the ring or behind a podium. It's found in being seen. Wiping his own tears quietly in the dimly lit room, President Ibrahim Traoré felt something he hadn't in years, a deep, unfiltered connection. He whispered softly in French, "Il a vraiment ressenti." He really felt it. It wasn't just a celebrity moment. It was something bigger, more honest, more human. Behind him, the walls weren't lined with portraits of politicians or generals, but with framed snapshots of the people he served, young children seated in crumbling classrooms, barefoot farmers tending dry soil, nurses in rural clinics, and soldiers who stood guard without armor. His people. Among them was one faded photograph, humble but powerful. A young Mike Tyson, shirtless, fists raised, eyes burning with pain and defiance. It wasn't about boxing. It never had been. It was about spirit, unyielding, raw, and forged in fire. Just a few feet away, the quiet was broken by his assistant stepping in, clipboard in hand, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Sir, the United Nations has reached out. They saw the interview. They want to reopen talks about your education reform proposal." Traoré didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the glowing television screen. "Let them wait," he replied, voice calm but firm. "Tonight isn't for politics. Tonight is for truth." Meanwhile, across the ocean in New York, that very truth was setting the world ablaze. The interview clip, Mike Tyson breaking down, clutching a letter from a faraway African leader, had gone viral within hours. It spread like wildfire through social media, news outlets, and message boards. Celebrities tweeted it. Schools played it in classrooms. Kids in refugee camps huddled around shared phones to watch. Tyson's tears, once thought impossible, had become a message to the world. But the story wasn't over, not even close. At precisely 12:07 a.m., Mike's phone rang. Unknown number. Foreign country code. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" A deep, composed voice responded. "Mr. Tyson, this is Ibrahim Traoré." Silence stretched between them. Mike's throat tightened. You're the guy from the letter?" "Yes," Traoré replied gently. "And you're the man who taught me how to survive when I had no shoes, no food, and no father." They didn't talk like icons. They didn't speak like public figures. They spoke like men who had fought their way out of shadows. "Thank you?" Mike whispered, eyes glassy. "No," Traoré replied. "Thank you. You gave me the courage to rise when everything told me to stay down." A long pause followed. "Mike," the the president continued. Would you ever consider coming to Burkina Faso? Mike blinked, surprised. What for? Not for a fight, right? No, Traoré said. For hope. That single word changed everything. In that moment, continents collapsed. Years of suffering bridged. Two boys, one from Brownsville, New York, the other from the dusty outskirts of Ouagadougou, had found each other through pain, and something extraordinary had just begun. Mike Tyson didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his hotel bed, the letter crumpled and re-straightened in his calloused hands. He read it over and over like scripture. One line echoed, "When I was 13, I fought not with gloves, but with hunger." Mike understood. He had once punched his way out of grocery stores with stolen bread. He had brawled on Brooklyn streets not to win, but to be seen. He remembered Juvenile Hall, the silence, the cold beds. No one believed in him, except one, Trainer. Just as Traoré had once had no one until he found belief in himself. The next morning, Mike's team filed into his dressing room ready to go over his tight schedule. Brand deals, commercial shoots, interviews. He looked up from the letter and tore the schedule in half. "I'm flying to Burkina Faso." They stared at him, stunned. "Are you sure?" one asked cautiously. Mike's eyes lit with that old flame. "It's not about boxing anymore. It's about the kid I was, and the boy he still is." 2 days later, Mike landed in Ouagadougou. There was no press swarm, no velvet ropes, just sun, wind, dust, and faces, wide-eyed children who couldn't believe what they were seeing. Barefoot kids ran alongside his car shouting, "Mike Tyson! Mike Tyson!" But he wasn't there to be a hero. He was there to listen. President Traoré greeted him at the modest government house. No suits, no podiums, just a handshake that lingered with unspoken history. They didn't talk about governments or policies. They talked about pain. Traoré took Mike to a rural school with crumbling walls but loud laughter. One boy had a bruised eye from a street fight. Mike sat on the dirt floor beside him. "You fight?" he asked softly. The boy nodded. "Me too," Mike whispered. "But the strongest punch you'll ever throw is the one you hold back." The boy looked at him, confused and curious. Mike slipped off his championship ring and handed it to him. The boy's hands trembled. At that moment, President Traoré knelt beside them. "In this country," he said gently, "you are not your scars. You are your spirit." The boy broke down crying. So did Mike. That night, under a wide sky and soft stars, the boxer and the president sat on a rooftop, drinking tea, listening to the city hum. Traoré handed Mike a small wooden box. "These are for you," he said. Inside were dozens of letters, handwritten by children all across Burkina Faso. They saw the video. They wanted to write to the man who inspired their president. Mike opened the first one. "Dear Mr. Tyson, you are a lion who made it through fire. Please don't forget us." He held it to his chest. Another read, "My papa died protecting our village, but now I believe I can be strong like you." Tears rolled down Mike's cheeks. He clutched the letters like sacred treasures. These are worth more than any belt I ever won." Traoré nodded. "And now you understand, brother. Pain connects us deeper than fame ever could." The wind stirred softly, rustling the pages like whispers. In that stillness, no words were needed. What bonded them wasn't power or celebrity. It was survival and healing. Mike flipped through the final letters. One stood out, torn notebook paper, written in pencil. "Dear Mr. Tyson, my name is Maddie. I am 11 years old. My father was a soldier. He said your fights gave him courage in the war. Now he's gone. But I watch you, and I feel brave again." Mike closed his eyes, holding the letter tight. In a world full of headlines, this was the real story. courage," the letter had read. "He died last year. Now I try to be brave. I heard you cry. That means even lions cry. So maybe I can cry too." Mike Tyson's hands trembled as he clutched that piece of torn notebook paper. His eyes scanned the child's words again, but his heart had already memorized them. Even lions cry. That one sentence shattered every wall Mike had ever built to protect himself. It cracked open a memory long buried. A vision of himself at age 11, staring at his mother's frail body as she slipped further into illness, and knowing the world had no soft place for boys like him. The kind who cried in the dark when no one was around. The kind who fought because they had nowhere else to run. He whispered aloud, voice barely audible, "Even lions cry." President Ibrahim Traoré stood nearby, his own eyes filled with understanding and something unspoken. He gently placed a hand on Mike's shoulder and said, "That boy, Maddie, he lives not far from here. Would you like to meet him?" Mike didn't reply with words. He simply nodded, eyes still wet, heart already racing. The next morning, just after sunrise, they set out in an old government SUV. The roads were unpaved and dusty, lined with baobab trees and life in its most unfiltered form. Goats meandered lazily. Women balanced jugs of water on their heads. Young boys played barefoot soccer using a ball made from twisted plastic bags. And through it all, Mike stared out the window, thinking of the boy who had unknowingly become his healer. After 2 hours, they arrived in a small village that seemed to stand still in time. Mud brick houses, corrugated tin roofs, and children who stopped whatever they were doing the moment the car pulled up. One boy stood in front of a small home, barefoot, shirt torn, but his eyes shone like stars. That was Maddie. He ran forward, but froze as he saw Mike step out. He wasn't looking at a boxing champion. He wasn't seeing fame or glory. He was looking at someone who had survived just like him, a man broken and rebuilt. Maddie clutched a photo in his small hands, creased and weathered from too many nights under a pillow. It was a picture of his father, a soldier, standing proud in uniform. A man now gone. Mike knelt slowly so they could be eye to eye. "You're braver than I ever was, little man," he said softly. Maddie blinked, his voice catching. "But I cry." Mike smiled, his eyes already glossy. "So do I." Then without warning, Maddie stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Mike. It wasn't a performative hug. It wasn't for a camera. It was the kind of hug a child gives when they're afraid someone might disappear again. Mike held him close, and then he broke. Tears poured down his face, heavy, uncontrollable sobs that came from a place deeper than pain. The kind of cry that had waited years to be released. His shoulders shook as he held that little boy and sobbed. Not for show, but for survival. The film crew respectfully kept their distance. There were no bright lights, no microphones. Only President Traoré stood nearby, hand pressed to his heart, eyes filled with emotion. He knew. This wasn't just a hug. This was pain meeting pain, loss embracing loss. And in that sacred silence, healing was being born. Later, they sat under the cool shade of a mango tree. The branches swayed gently above them as birds chirped in the distance. Maddie, still holding his father's photo, looked up at Mike and asked, "Will you leave too?" There was so much vulnerability in his voice, as if every adult in his life had once said goodbye. Mike leaned forward, looked the boy straight in the eyes, and whispered, "I'll be back, I promise." And for the first time in years, he truly meant it. Mike flew back to the U.S. 2 days later. The moment his plane landed, media was already buzzing. He was scheduled for a major interview, originally intended to promote a new documentary and memoir. But when he sat down under the bright lights of the TV studio, everything had changed. The host smiled, trying to keep it light. "You've been off the grid, Mike. Africa, huh? What were you doing over there? Starting a new fight club?" Mike chuckled, then his expression grew serious. "Actually," he said, pausing, "I was being healed by an 11-year-old boy." The entire room went still. Mike reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Maddie's letter, unfolding it with care. His voice cracked as he read aloud, "Even lions cry." He stopped, overcome, and then, right there, live on national television. The baddest man in boxing began to cry. Not a single camera cut away. The host lowered his head in respect. The audience watched, mesmerized. This was no act. This was a man laying his soul bare. "I met kids over there who've lost everything," Mike said, wiping his tears. "But they still have more heart than most champions I've ever known." He turned directly to the camera, his gaze piercing. "Ibrahim Traoré," he said, "thank you. Thank you for reminding me that real strength isn't fists. It's love." There wasn't a dry eye in the studio, and across the world, millions watched. Some smiled, some wept, but all of them felt something rare and precious: hope. The next morning, before the sun fully rose, Mike's phone rang. Unknown number again. Something told him to answer. "Mike Tyson?" a familiar voice asked gently. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso." There was a pause, long, heavy with meaning. "I saw what you did for Maddie," Traoré said. "You didn't just honor his father. You healed something in him, and maybe in yourself, too." Mike sat silently, throat tight. "I want to invite you back," Traoré continued. "But this time, not just for one boy, for a nation. I want you to speak to our youth, to tell your story, to show them what rising from nothing really looks like." Mike exhaled deeply. His voice cracked. "You don't know what that means to me." "I do," Traoré replied. Within 48 hours, Mike was on a plane heading back to Burkina Faso. But this time, it wasn't about boxing. It was about redemption, about purpose. It was about transforming scars into stories of survival. The schoolyard in Ouagadougou was packed when he arrived. Hundreds of students sat cross-legged on the dusty ground, wearing faded uniforms, holding worn notebooks and old pictures of Mike Tyson ripped from newspapers. There was no stage, no spotlight, just Mike, a folding chair, and a translator. He began to speak slowly, each word deliberate. "I used to think I was just a weapon, a fighter. I didn't know I had a heart until I listened to a child." He told them about Maddie, about his own mother's death, about stealing, jail, the anger, about how the boxing ring wasn't a place to win. It was the only place he could hide from the pain, and then he stood up and stepped into the crowd. Mike stood in the middle of the crowd, sweat beading on his brow, dust swirling in the air. Then he pointed directly at a boy in the audience. "You," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "You think no one sees you, but I do. You're strong, even when you feel broken inside." The boy's lip quivered. Tears began streaming down his cheeks. Then another child broke down, and then another. Soon the air was filled with the quiet sound of young hearts letting go of long-held pain. It wasn't loud, but it was powerful. Their tears weren't weakness. They were truth. Healing had begun. At the back of the crowd stood President Ibrahim Traoré, his arms folded, his eyes wet. He discreetly wiped a tear from his cheek. This wasn't a public address or a planned speech anymore. It had become something much deeper. It was no longer about a celebrity visit. It was a revolution of hearts, sparked not by politics or power, but by honesty, pain, and raw human connection. That evening, Mike and President Traoré sat under a sky freckled with stars. They were alone, no press, no advisors, no cameras, just two men, both of whom had carried burdens heavier than most would ever understand. For a long time, they didn't speak. Then Mike broke the silence. "Why did you write that letter, Mr. President?" he asked, his voice low. Traoré turned to him, a soft smile crossing his face. "Because I saw the boy behind the fighter," he said simply. "And I believed the world still needed him." Mike tried to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. Then President Traoré added, "You reminded my people that strength isn't about fists. It's about how many times you get back up when life keeps knocking you down." Mike nodded slowly. "That's all I ever tried to do," he whispered. They didn't shake hands like politicians. They clasped hands like brothers, two survivors from different worlds, but with the same wounds. Bye. The next morning, images from Mike's visit to the school had gone viral. But this wasn't the usual kind of fame. These pictures weren't about celebrity. They were about transformation. The world saw him kneeling, hugging children, listening, truly listening, and in those clips, people saw not a boxer, but a man who finally understood what it meant to heal. Mike Tyson left Burkina Faso not just as a sports icon, but as a soul reborn. And Ibrahim Traoré, already respected as a leader, was now seen by millions as something rarer, a leader who listened with his heart. Back in New York, Mike returned to the television studio where this new chapter had first begun. The host, smiling warmly, welcomed him back. The producers had planned a light-hearted interview, talk of travel, recovery, maybe a few jokes. But what unfolded was something none of them could script. The lights dimmed. Mike looked different now, not in appearance, but in energy. Softer, grounded. His hands trembled slightly as the host asked, "Mike, what changed you the most in Burkina Faso?" Mike looked directly at the camera, his voice barely above a whisper. "A child and a president." He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a carefully folded piece of paper, a drawing worn at the edges. It was from me, the boy from the village. A simple sketch. Mike holding Me's hand, President Traoré standing behind them both, smiling. The studio went silent. Mike swallowed. "He doesn't want to fight anymore," he said, eyes misting. "He just wants to grow." The audience sat, still. The usually quick-witted host said nothing. No one could. Mike's voice broke again. "That boy, he gave me peace. And the president, he gave me purpose." A single tear slid down Mike's face. And in that moment, the world didn't see Iron Mike, the knockout king. They saw a man who had finally found his reason. A man no longer defined by his past, but guided by his healing. Later, sitting alone in his dressing room, Mike stared into the mirror. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. A staff member entered, handing him a brown envelope. "It just arrived." "International mail," she said. Mike carefully tore it open. Inside was a letter from President Traoré. The handwriting was unmistakable. The message, profound. "My brother Mike, they call me a president, but I am only a man who dreams. Dreams of healing. Dreams of peace. Your visit reminded us that pain is not the end, it's the beginning. If we dare to feel it, not fight it. Burkina Faso, thanks you. I thank you. And the boy now sleeps peacefully." Mike read it once, then again. Then he pressed it to his chest, and for the first time in decades he whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for every broken kid in the world, and every leader brave enough to listen. "I was never the baddest man on the planet," he said to no one. "I was just a boy waiting to be heard. and someone finally did. A week later, Mike stood on a balcony in Harlem. Below, a small group of kids boxed with hand-me-down gloves. He wasn't there as their coach, just a quiet presence, watching. 1. Boy tripped hard, falling on the concrete. Mike didn't laugh. He walked down, knelt beside him, and helped him up. Every fall, he told the boy, teaches you how to rise. Just then his phone buzzed. A photo had arrived from Burkina Faso. Me was smiling, standing tall beside a gleaming new boxing gym. Above the doors, a sign read, Tyson Hope Center. Built by the government, signed off by President Traoré himself. Mike stared at the image, his eyes burning. The world once called him a monster. Now, a child across the ocean saw him as a mentor. And that was enough.